been bleeding. Yeah?
Did you change the band-aid or not?
No, I'm going to do something.
Better change it.
Yeah.
It
Won't be so long.
I wouldn't.
I was going to go this morning and I ran out of time.
I have it this morning.
Before bedding and stuff, I just need to go after. Are you going to go back to the center or are you going to go straight to the... Yeah?
Well, yeah, why don't we do
The leader's dialogue is on today.
What?
The one leader's dialogue.
I'm going to do some.
Which day did he tell you? I think it's good.
So what do you do? Should I get you a email for the...
I'll do it.
You should actually get rid of
Do you know who's in the world dialogues today? The leaders dialogue?
This should be it. Is it not so much at the beginning that it's taken? These type of things? This one
it's
is
for
right here?
security.
Yeah, yeah.
Ah, okay, go to that.
We'll mix those around. Now we have more people coming in. You moved up now. It's up to you if you're more comfortable here or. Okay, so.
Special invitation for
Is there one free spot here? Is this one free? Except it will be with the back again.
That's where
Somebody's sitting here?
Claudio was sitting there.
A lot of you left. Okay. And ma'am, please, would you feel comfortable sitting here? Yes?
Should be closer to the box of documents.
Yes, you're closer to where the action is happening. Okay? All right, let's get started. You just need to kind of come back now.
So everyone's teaching different things.
Yeah. Okay, good. You were all on time. You all get chocolates at the end for that. Let's please introduce our new people that's just joined us. If could just, we have this exercise this morning. If you could just say your name, where you work, why you were here, and if you can think of something unusual about yourself that you would like to tell for everybody else. Okay, would you please introduce yourself?
I'm Mustafa Al-Baksi from Sultan of Oman. I'm working for Ministry of Agriculture and Fishery as the head of Seed and Plant Genetic Resources Lab in the Directorate of Agriculture Research. In this directorate we have different sections. There's the protection and plant production.
Okay.
And taking care or responsible of the conservation of plant in our ministry. So we started different projects in this concern, trying to collect or running a collection mission for the forage and the medicinal plants.
Okay, all right.
And,
why you are here?
just to get new information and to know more about the conservation and what I can do for.
Okay. Anything unusual about you that you can think of? That you would like, somebody said
I'm a mother of three. One of them is finishing business in Australia, and the other in America. He's doing the environment also.
Okay,
And the
very
second in the last year, and I'm doing my PhD at the moment in Cardiff University.
Okay, very good. Congratulations. Yes, please, ma'am.
I am Suad Abimani from Sultan Oman. I am working as a marine ecologist in the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries there.
Okay.
My work is as a technician. I have a bachelor degree in biotechnology, but I am working as a technician in environment laboratories in marine science and fisheries center related to the ministry.
Okay, and why you are here?
I am here to get good experience from other people from different countries and new information.
Okay, and anything unusual about you? Somebody said they're afraid of water. Somebody said they don't like cockroaches. Somebody likes turtles.
Actually, I like nature.
Yeah? Okay.
And I am a designer.
Okay,
I
cool.
like Photoshop. I like to work with play with colors and others.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So look, we're here. We've done this. Just let our participants know where we are. We've talked about what is disaster risk reduction this morning. We've had our coffee break. Hope you've got coffee coming in. Now we're going to talk about what is ecosystem-based DRR. We're going to just switch around a little bit. We have one exercise that we're going to keep. We're going to switch just the order around a little bit. So right now we're here, and Radhika's going to give us a brief introduction to what is ecosystem-based DRR. Please, Radhika. Thank you.
Okay, so Karen gave a definition of disaster, or at least the framework that we consider disaster in this morning, and what it means, vulnerability, exposure, and how this interlinks and interplays with ecosystems. Now, what can we actually do as environment managers to bring disaster management and ecosystem management together? What are some of the concrete rationale we can use to convince people, as well as some concrete tools we can use as people who work in conservation to start linking with disaster management? So what I'll do is quickly give you an idea of how IUCN ended up with working in disasters, and then we move to the spiral Karen put up, and what we'll do is go through every stage of that spiral and see what the entry points and rationale for ecosystem is, and what tools are available to this day that you can use to address the various phases of those of disaster management. So just a few examples. This is a watershed management project from IUCN's water program that was working in Guatemala. Pure water management project, and then Cyclone Stan hit. And the community, they lost 200,000 people or something. The communities came to IUCN and said they needed help in addressing the landslides and floods. So a very conservation-focused project that ended up working with disaster management. And they used the 3D models that you can see on the left side to map out the risk they face, for their houses face with landslides, with they don't have aerial photos, these communities. So we had to develop 3D maps to help them understand what the risks are, what dangers are posed where they live. And then they identified some native species that they could produce in nurseries to start rehabilitating these slopes so they could reduce their risks to disasters. So this was one of the typical environment projects that ended up by default working in disasters. Another one was Mangrove Rehabilitation. Western Indian Ocean, tsunami came, and suddenly we started realizing the role of mangroves, and there was a lot of money and effort invested in restoring mangroves around Southeast Asian coasts. Here's another project, community forestry project. They realized not only were they contributing to livelihoods, not only were they contributing to biodiversity, but they were actually helping improve slope stability, which contributed to reducing landslides and further environmental degradation. Now, just one of the typical examples of why, one of our flagship slides for trying to convince people why we should consider ecosystems. And this is a work that Karen did in West Indian Ocean. This is from Brian, one of our colleagues that Karen works very closely with. And I'm going to try my best to explain this. So if you look at this, here's a resort in the coast of Sri Lanka which cleared its sand dunes because the tourists wanted a good view of the ocean. And look at what happened when the tsunami hit. Here's one, just right here, there is another resort, and eco resort, and because of this sand dune, or that's what they say, because of this sand dune, it was protected, nobody died, and the infrastructure did not get damaged. And here, there were 27 people dead, and everything ruined. Here's some pictures from Japan from last month's training that Masunori was with us as well. Just having coastal forests. Firstly, it discourages people from living right in the coast. Secondly, when the tsunami happened, what you see, these rings are fishing boats that were caught in the forest. And if this forest wasn't here, these boats would have landed on people and their property and probably killed more people and damaged more property. So not only do they act as protection for people, but they also help act as filter for debris when such things happen. So we've had various work in the past few decades working on disaster management issues, but IUCN and largely conservation community have never really communicated it and reached out to disaster managers, climate change managers, saying, hey, all of this work actually contributes to what you're doing as well, so let's work together. Now, as I said, the spiral Karen showed, the idea is to not be stuck in this circle, but if you're doing your disaster management well, then you start progressing upwards because your risks are reducing, your damage every time is reducing, and you're actually moving towards more sustainable development, less loss of lives and property, and you start breaking that cycle and progressing upwards. So what we'll do is we'll look at each phase, look at some rationale for each phase of disaster management, and then some tools which you can incorporate. You see these red arrows, Karen had them as green. These are entry points we can use to bring in ecosystem management perspectives. So we'll go through the cycle and see what we can do as environment managers to bring ecosystems into this picture. Sorry, just going back. So for risk and vulnerability assessment, even starting right here, we can bring in a lot of ecosystem perspective in here. If you're doing a project on the mountains on slope restoration or something, looking at how to obtain a hazard profile in an area. What are the root causes of the hazard? Perhaps ecosystem degradation. How much do we take that into account? Are they related to environmental management, our land use planning? So just when you do your environmental projects, look at a hazard assessment. It could just be communities walking out and doing an observation, a trail walk, we call it, or doing more substantive risk mapping like these 3D models. And that we can do this within our environmental projects themselves. Vulnerability assessment, talking to communities about some environmental dimensions or drivers of vulnerability, the use of natural resources, how we degrade our resources, which can actually further on compromise the natural buffer that ecosystems have against risk reduction. How are we using our resources, which may potentially increase our vulnerabilities? Are we doing the right kind of cropping on slopes, or are we actually making the landslide issues, the slope stabilization issues worse from the practices, our land use practices? Some tools to do this. There's Crystal, Community Risk Assessment Tool for Adaptation and Livelihoods, community-based risk screening tool for what kind of risks we face, what kind of resources we have, and what kind of capacities we have that can actually help us reduce our vulnerabilities, make us more resilient, and secure our livelihoods. CARE International has a community vulnerability capacity assessment tool that can be used at that risk assessment phase. UNDP has a vulnerability assessment guidance that can be used. So these are all community risk assessment tools that we can actually use within our projects to start considering the hazard element, the risk element within our projects or work. Now, later on this afternoon, we'll have Joe Schott, who is from one of the NGOs we work with in Thailand. And what they've done is a very good job of integrating these three, the best of these three methods, into a integrated vulnerability and capacity assessment for both disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And he'll take you through some of these exercises, how to fill the matrix, how to do some of the analysis this afternoon. And the idea is to go from making people aware about climate change and disaster, what kind of information communities and stakeholders need together, to turning that information into their capacities and strengths in being able to reduce their vulnerabilities. And why this is cyclical is because adaptation, risk reduction is a learning process. We can't start here and finish here and say we're done. Every time there's a new disaster, every time there's a change in one of the capacities or the factors that affect us, we need to go back and relearn. So it's a constant learning phase. And what Joe's team has done is look at vulnerabilities in the context of risks and capacities. Are you more at risk with less capacity? And how vulnerable does that make you? Or are you do you have enough capacities to outweigh your risks so that you're resilient to what's coming next? So the previous three were actually methods for community-based risk mapping. One of the very specific tools for ecosystem degradation and being able to quantify ecosystem services that contribute to risk reduction is this method from UNEP called RIVAMP. So there's a whole process, and I'm not going to go through this whole process of how RIVAMP works, but the idea is to use spatial analysis, use GIS analysis and statistical modeling to show the role of ecosystem services in risk reduction, but be able to quantify that. So if I say I've got 10 hectares of seaweed, how much of wave energy does that reduce? And how much more of seagrass do I need to be able to protect the communities? So it goes through a whole analysis process, and it brings out not only the quantified, measurable contribution of ecosystems to risk reduction, but also how much it costs. They do valuation of restoration efforts, whether it's mangroves, whether it's seagrass, whether it's restoring the slopes. So this is an option for you if you're interested. RIVAMP is run by our colleagues in UNEP, and they'd be more than happy to come and help you, train you in this method, as well as conduct some of the analysis. Now moving on to the risk reduction phase. Why ecosystems and how ecosystems? As Karen said in some of her slides, vegetation, a very natural solution to stabilizing slopes. Reduces landslides, reduces the rate of erosion. Wetlands not only absorb water when there's a flood, but they actually provide pathways for water to flow during a flood, so the water stays away from people and property. In Lebanon, we have this really famous case where, to reduce risks of fires, we've been using very highly resilient native species, fire-resilient native species, that break the forest cover so that you have smaller segments of pine forest to deal with when there's a fire, and they come to these native species buffer where there's more chances of the fire being reduced and therefore being able to put it out. Again, vegetation management in drylands to improve drought resilience, to improve water tables, another very natural solution that we can promote. Mangroves, salt marshes, sand dunes, buffer against windstorms, sandstorms, and surges. So, some of the tools that we think we may need to do ecosystem management are very much the tools we use every day. Integrated coastal zone management, integrated water resource management, community-based natural resource management. These are things we are familiar with as environment managers. We use every day, but perhaps we don't use them for risk management. And why?